Julius Evola. The Myth of the Blood. Translated by John Leonard. Extract from the 8th chapter, The Racist Vision of History. Let us now turn to the latest developments of racism, in the sense of a vision of the world and of a racist vision of history, which have occurred in the very inner circles of National Socialism. In this connection, we must consider above all the ideas of Alfred Rosenberg, which have an almost official character. However much Rosenberg has declared that his ideas should not be identified as a credo of the National Socialist Party, nonetheless his influence in Germany is noteworthy, especially in the organizations which aim toward the politico-spiritual formation of the new generation. Rosenberg draws his principal inspiration from the theories of Chamberlain, accenting them however in the Nordist sense, which is to say by substituting, for the Chamberlainian concept of the racial Celto-Slavo-Teutonic unity, that of the pure Nordic race, and by giving to the whole a yet more evident anti-Catholic coloration, and establishing points of contact between the general interpretation of history and the new German myth. The influence of Chamberlain is associated then with that of Wirth and, to a certain degree, that of Bachofen. Bachofen was a Swiss, a contemporary of Nietzsche's, and today has been particularly revaluated in Germany. As a philologist, archaeologist, and mythologist, at the base of his often ingenious reconstructions, Bachofen posits the antithesis between two types of civilization and of religiosity, the one of the solar type, celestial and virile, connected to social systems erected on pure paternal right, the other of telluric type, the adoration of the forces of the earth, feminine, the adoration of the mothers of life, connected to promiscuous and more or less communist social systems erected on matriarchies. The relation of these two types of civilization, the one to the Nordic races and the other to the southern races, had more or less already been carried out by various researchers and historians who took their bearings by the school of Müller. Rosenberg takes up these orientations from Bachofen, and equally from the theory of the origins of Rome and of the anti-Roman character of the Etruscan civilization. In one of his speeches to the Bavarian students, Rosenberg did not hesitate to declare that the discovery of the racist soul in the history of civilizations constitutes a revolution of no less import than that of Copernicus. To which are associated the following characteristic words of his principal book, The Myth of the 20th Century. Today a new faith is awakening, the myth of the blood, the belief that to defend the blood is also to defend the divine nature of man in general. It is a belief, effulgent with the brightest knowledge, that Nordic blood represents that mysterium which has overcome and replaced the older sacraments. Every race has its soul and every soul its race. There exists no disembodied and universal values. Blood and spirit are, for Rosenberg, only two different aspects of one unique and indissoluble reality. Race is the outward image of a definite soul. Today an entire generation is beginning to have a presentiment that values are only created and preserved where the law of blood still determines the ideas and actions of men, whether consciously or unconsciously. The history of every race is therefore natural, and at the same time mystical. Behind every religious form, moral or artistic, there are living nations conditioned by race. In the intermixing of the blood all candid values are in the end driven apart, the individualities of peoples disappear into ethnic chaos, and an amalgam which vegetates and does not create, or which becomes materially or spiritually the tributary of the strongest will of a new pure race. History then, for Rosenberg, obeys no predestined plan, toward the realization of which each people is assigned its various tasks. The history of the Hindus, of the Persians, of the Greeks, etc., was not therefore the preparation nor the prelude of our epoch, and still less was it a preliminary attempt which culminated in the Christianization of all the races, all the nations, but it discloses rather a dramatic battle between the various races and between the various souls of the races. Moreover, in the events of this battle, referred back more or less to the events of the Nordic race in the various civilizations which preceded us, Rosenberg sees the coming of that light which brings out also the lineaments of the visage of this race itself, so as to gradually determine the content of the racist myth, the myth which is to serve as the basis of the 20th century. From here proceeds precisely the latest development of history on a racist basis, but, also, a species of vicious circle. Indeed, to grasp the profoundest sense of history of civilizations, one refers to the idea of race, and on the other hand, to define the content of this idea, one refers to the history of civilizations. The fact is that elements of every kind converge in these constructions. Results of this are that scientific research associated to intuitions, disparate elements giving the air of fortifying one another, but which are in reality chosen and regulated by a pre-existing central idea. So far as prehistory goes, Rosenberg more or less assumes the ideas of worth regarding the migrations of the Nordic Atlantic race in America, Europe, and Asia, and regarding its originating fatherland. In Rosenberg, therefore, the same obscure sensation of a primordial truth manifests itself. Hindu civilization was created by Nordic stock which descended into that country around 2000 BC. These are the Arya, which subjected the aboriginal peoples, creating simultaneously a barrier of racial defense against them, by means of a caste system. We are already familiar with this idea, derived from the fact that in Sanskrit, to speak of caste one speaks of color, so that the inferior castes are often called dark and enemy, while the superior castes are called fair and divine. In the first testimony that one finds for the Hindus or for one of their branches around 1400 BC, they are called Hari, that is blondes or redheads, and the Hindu tradition speaks of the most ancient national deity, Indra, who with his white friends, conquers the country, repulsing from their thrones, from place to place, the black men. These are described as beings without nose, which is to be understood as snub-nosed, while the Arya are thought of as great, white, fair, and beautifully nosed. The first Hindu period was a period of expansion and at the same time of battle against the magical cults and the low ecstaticism of the indigenous peoples. But these inferior forms reacted against the Arya spirituality, they insinuated themselves into it, they adulterated it. If the originating sensation that the successive pantheism, the degeneration of this sentiment into that of a unity of all things and thus of the equality of all beings, already signified, for Rosenberg, the decadence of the Arya race. Another sign of decadence was the prestige which the priestly caste assumed over that warrior caste. That which presents itself in this period as mysticism is less a product of the heroic and aristocratic spirituality of the Arya warrior caste, descendant from the ancient Indo-Germans, so much as a species of sublimation of animism and of the magical conceptions of the aboriginals. The interpretation which Gunther puts on Buddhism as characteristics of a certain racist mentality and of a spiritual sensibility which is certainly not so very developed. The term yoga, which in Sanskrit designates spiritual discipline, connected to the Latin jugum, has amongst the Anglo-Saxons the value of self-control, and appeared among the Hellenes as in krateia and sophrosine and still again in Stoicism, as apatheia, amongst the Romans as the bluntly Roman temperantia and disciplina, which is eminently recognizable still in late Roman Stoicism, nihil admirari. The same value appears in medieval chivalry as mesura and in the German language as diumasi. Regarding the heroes of Spanish legend, who are described as typical Nordics, it is said of the blonde Cid Campeador that he appeared so very measured, tan miserato. The Nordic trait of self-discipline, of restraint in the most recent period of certain Germanic peoples which have already been denordicized, giving place to the idea of a mortification of the senses and to ascesis. The ancient Indo-German affirmed life. Under the influence of pre-Aryan forms, one associated ascesis to the ancient Hindu concept of yoga, which derived from the style of restraint and of self-discipline proper to the Nordic race, ascesis being the idea that with exercises and various practices, even corporeal, one might reach liberation from the world, which is to say a supernatural strengthening of the will. The most noteworthy transformation in such a direction is found precisely in Buddhism, in which the vital originating Nordic impetus, brought into an environment which was no longer adequate, an environment which thus was felt to be an environment of pain, so to speak introverts itself, it renders itself into an instrument of evasion and of liberation from life, from pain. Beginning with the diffusion of Buddhism, the state of the Arya's descendant loses ever more its power. Beginning from the Nauda and Maurya dynasty, that is from the 4th century BC, dominators of inferior caste appear, ethical life is adulterated, the sensualistic element is developed. For Aryan of Nordic India, one can therefore calculate a millennium of life, more or less from 1400 to 400. The incomprehension for and the depreciation of aesthetic values in the face of warrior values, at bottom of a merely secular and naturalistic type, which the interpretations above demonstrate, and which had already taken their start from the Nietzschean philosophy of life, bring Rosenberg and with him various others to esteem the Persian civilization more than the Hindu. Even the Persian civilization was according to Rosenberg created by Arya races, which indeed in their traditions remember even their originating Arctic fatherland and the freeze which forced them to emigrate. The doctrine of Zarathustra fortified the style of life of these races once they dispersed and lost a unique central authority. The doctrine of Zarathustra, which did not lose itself in contemplations or ascesis hostile to the world, but which makes of the divinity Ahura Mazda the divine protector of Aryanism. It gives as a religious vision the heroic battle for this god against the god of shadows and his emissaries, which often bear the traits of non-Arya populations. It gives a whole series of norms as an ethics, in which the preoccupation with a purity of life, of body and of blood, has a conspicuous place. From the time that the White Land, which is to say the Arctic fatherland, disappears, writes von Leers, the Arya spirit has never found a nobler doctrine than that of Zarathustra. From the original knowledge of the grand order of the world, here the vocation of the man of the high race is drawn, the vocation to disseminate the truth, and to battle the lie, the chivalric vocation of the light bearer. The splendor of the Aryan land, the lance of Persian man, with the great king Cyrus, Darius, with the noble knight, Artha-Kshatriya, whom we know as Artaxerxes, and with the luminous dynasties of Persepolis, extended itself throughout Asia Minor. For Gunther, the well-known idea of a divine order in the world stands out particularly in the doctrine of Zarathustra. The broad vision of the Indo-European, a vision of man summoned to spiritual freedom, to theoria, or beholding, gazing, as perfected by the classical art of the Hellenes, such a vision comprehends the whole world, and all divine government and all responsible human life in it, as part of a divine order. The Indians called it Rita, over which Mithra and Varuna, Uranos in Greek mythology, stand guard, the guardian of Rita. The Persians called it Asha or To, that is salvation, right, order. The Hellenes, cosmos. The Italicii, ratio. The Teutons, orlog, or Midgard. Hermann Lommel, in Zarathustra and his teaching, speaks of a lawful order of world events, which the Iranians are said to have represented. Such an idea, the idea of a world order in which both gods and men are arranged, permeates the teaching of the Stoics, and when Cicero, in De Legibus and De Finibus, praises virtue, virtus, as the perfection of reason, which rules the entire world, natura, then he once more expressed the idea of universal ordered life. But this impulse to give order and form to that which is formless, translated into an impulse toward empire, appears to these authors predetermined by that destiny which already Gobineau has recognized. With the expansion of the Persian strength over non-Persian domains, the denortification of the Persian element had already been prepared. The usual causes, intermixing of the blood, decadence of the peasantry, the destructive action of large urban areas, the introduction of spurious and exotic cults. Following the familiar line of thought, racism here comes to see in the new religion of Mithras, Mithraism, a sign of the decadence of the ancient religion of Zarathustra. Mithras appears as a god of the imperialistic period, wherefore even in Rome he had the significance of a fator imperi, and for this reason, he is seen less as an Arya god than as a god of all the populations of the empire, whose cult ends by assuming non-Arya traits. If Mithras preserves the Nordic characteristics of custodian of justice, of purity and of veracity, as well as having the aspect of the warrior god, at the same time he presents the mystical anti-Nordic characteristics of a savior, something which already smacks of dualism and of the scission between soul and body proper to the Levantine race. Before the Romans, the kings of the Sassanid dynasty presented themselves as the renovators of Zarathustra's doctrine, and when the last of them fell under the Islamic onslaught, the last believers of the ancient Arya religion of light, the Parsi, sought refuge in the direction of India, bringing with them the last remains of the Aryan tradition. Rosenberg writes, "Cut into the rock walls of Begistun on the order of a great Persian emperor are the words, I, Darius, the great king, king of kings, of Aryan race. Today, the Iranian mule driver passes, uncomprehendingly, by this wall, a sign to the multitude that personality is born and dies with the race." In Greece, meanwhile, the same destiny more or less repeated itself. Together with Kretschmer, Gunther distinguishes three strata in the Greek people. Above all a non-Indo-Germanic stratum, then a Proto-Indo-Germanic stratum related to the cycle of Minoan and Cretan civilization, finally, a recent Indo-Teutonic stratum, constituted by the Hellenes descended from the north, of Nordic type. This emigration of Hellenes in its turn consists of three waves, the Ionian wave, then the Achaean wave, and finally the Dorian wave, which appeared when the previous Indo-Germans had already largely been denorticized. The race which the Hellenes found in the conquered territories had the name of Pelasgians. In part, they were crushed and destroyed, in part enslaved. Herodotus recounts an epoch of his people during which no slaves existed. Only the Hellenic emigration created a caste system with the division into the free and the non-free, which had the ethnic meaning of the subordination of a non-Nordic population, enslaved before a class of rulers, predominantly of Nordic type. The gods of the Iliad and of the Odyssey are blonde, Athena has blue eyes and Demeter is blonde. Aphrodite is golden blonde, and amongst the heroes, Achilles, Menelaus, and Meleager are blonde. Hector on the other hand, as a foreigner and enemy, is described as black. Apollo, Rhadamanthus, and Aurora are blonde. Poseidon on the other hand has dark eyes and hair, and precisely this god of the sea is not a Hellenic god, but a pre-Hellenic god. In his characteristics he takes us back to the semi-bestial figure of the world of the demons and of the gods of the ancient Mediterranean. The fact that the iris in Greece had the name precisely of Iris, sends us once more to the clear color of the eyes that amongst the Hellenes must have been normal. And Gunther proceeds along this road, searching for Nordic characteristics in the most representative traditions and art of the Hellenes. The battle of Hyperborean Apollo against the demon Python symbolizes, in his view, the conflict between the Nordic civilization of the light and the demonic civilization of the Aborigines. The constitution of Sparta reflects the same spirit of the Indo-Arya caste system. The three classes of the Spartiati, the Perioikoi, and the Ilati are interpreted racistically in the way we have already stated. The first is constituted by the rulers of Dorian lineage, the second, subordinate though constituted by free men, is related to the descendants of the pre-Dorians, that is of the already denordicized Achaeans, the third, servile class gathered elements of a predominantly Western and Oriental Levantine race. Analogous considerations are carried out for Athens. The mixing of the castes, and thus of the races, was originally forbidden. A wife has to be herself free and of the same state as her husband. Rosenberg meanwhile adopts the already mentioned ideas of Bachofen, with the following modification. If Bachofen had distinguished two strata in the whole of Greek culture, religion, and ethics, the one dominated by the feminine maternal principle and the other by the heroic virile principle, he had conceived the second as a superior form, evolved from the first in the breast of one and the same people. Rosenberg on the other hand denies this concept of development relating to two strata and to two different races, the establishment of Olympic civilization and paternal right in the place of the matriarchy and of the ancient Mediterranean demonism, and of the heroic spirit in the place of the naturalistic and promiscuous spirit, are taken by him as so many victories of the Nordic Hellenic races over the Mediterranean, Southern, Pelasgian, Phoenician, Levantine one. For him, Dionysianism, Pythagorism, Orphic mysticism and the mystery traditions in general are similarly exotic extra-Hellenic phenomena, all alterations of Nordic Dorian Hellas. In the view of these authors, the decadence of the Nordic spirit of race came to Greece through the destruction wreaked by fratricidal wars, through the prevailing of economic and mercantile interests, sensualism, demographic decadence, which little by little brought the emancipation of inferior ethnic elements and a general intermixing. The interior liberty of the ancient Hellenes, their sense of responsibility, stood for Rosenberg in continual tension with the obtuse and impure spirit of Asia Minor. And Greek democracy for him did not signify the sovereignty of the people, but the sovereignty of Asia Minor over a Hellenic stock which was exhausted in its blood and in its men. Moreover, as regards Apollo, that is the symbol of the Dorian Nordic religion of light, both Rosenberg and Bachofen agree. In spite of the sacrifice of the Greeks, therefore, Apollo may be credited with the first great victory of Nordic Europeans, for after him there emerged from the Hyperborean fastnesses new bearers of the same values of freedom of soul and spirit, of organic shaping and questing creativity. For a long time the Roman sword repelled the reinforced Near Eastern spectre. More rigorously and consciously, Rome nurtured the patriarchal principle. It thereby strengthened the idea of the state as such and of marriage as the prerequisite of national and racial preservation. Finally, in time, Germania, in a new form, became the representative of the god of the heavens. Whereupon we find ourselves brought to consider the racist interpretation of our very own Roman civilization. According to racism, even Rome was founded by a wave of peoples which crashed upon it long before the Teutons and the Gauls, in the fertile valley south of the Alps, shattering the Etruscan dominion, the domain of this mysterious and foreign, Levantine people, joining itself most probably to a yet pure Mediterranean stock, and ever demonstrating a steady Nordic character, since the dominating element in it, the agricultural and heroic element joined nimbleness of intellect with the iron energy. Here too Rosenberg takes up the ideas of Bachofen on the genesis and the essence of the Roman civilization, opposing this civilization to the previous Etruscan and in general Italic civilization. But in contrast to Bachofen, here, too, he introduces the ethnic criterion. The demonic naturalistic spirit for him yet once again manifested itself in the pre-Roman element, a priestly and disordered spirit of the ancient southern Mediterranean races, while in the Roman civilization, one of a virile and aristocratic type, similar to the Dorian civilization, arose once again. Save for that, while ethnically the Hellenic type is Nordic with a Dinaric component, the Roman type according to Rosenberg was Nordic with a stronger Oriental and Phallic component. The Indo-Germanization of Italy did not have however the extension that it had enjoyed in Greece, because the Romans managed to subdue the great kingdom of the Etruscans only in the 4th century BC. And Rosenberg here does not tire of bringing attention to the frightful depictions of the afterlife proper to the Etruscans. In Dante's Inferno, in his opinion, be it ever portrayed ever so grandiosely, Etruscan antiquity lives once more, their superstitious ritualism, their obscene demonism of Levantine type. Though the Romans politically destroyed the Etruscan element, in various forms of their civilization they succumbed to it. The Etruscan Haruspex conserved his power, and it was he who opened the doors of Rome to Asia Minor, calling to his aid the Great Mother, the goddess Sibyl, with her eunuch priests, at the moment of the Carthaginian threat. For Rosenberg, the Etruscan heredity gathered from Rome, and thence from Catholicism, corresponds to its anti-Nordic element par excellence. Gunther gives to the ancient Roman social constitution the usual racist interpretation. The patricians corresponded to the descendants of the conquerors of Nordic blood, the plebs and clients to the descendants of the aboriginal populations which were predominantly Western, and, in the north, even Alpine Western. To patricians and plebs corresponded to two distinct forms of marriage, and originally, to preserve the purity of the blood, connubium was forbidden between the one class and the other, the patrician caste was to remain pure. The ill-born were killed in the Spartan way, it was the hygiene of the race. Virtus et gravitas characterized the ancient, true Roman, a nobilitas and an innate dignity, traits which were extremely similar to those of the Nordic type. The Senate for the entirety of the 1st century BC appears to be Nordic. It an enlightened audacity, a mastered bearing, a convinced and measured speech, a mediated deliberation, a cold sense of dominion. In the senatorial families, first in the patriciate, then in the nobilitas, arose the ideal of the true Roman, which sought to realize itself, that human model of Nordic nature, in a formation which was particularly Roman. Here moral values of the Nordic type held sway, virtus as virility, fortitude, sapientia, disciplina, gravitas, and pietas, ethical values which, when they were recognized, created Rome, and, when they were offended, tore it to pieces. But in against the Senate, the nobility, the firm conception of right and the ethical significance of the Roman state, there ever subsisted in Rome the priest, the Etruscan Haruspex, the impure plebeian religiosity, which little by little was nourished and sustained by foreign cults. Already from the time of the Republic the noble name of Flavus, blonde, was widespread, and Virgil made the creators of the kingdoms of Latium, Turnus, Camillus, and Lavinia blonde. Ovid describes not only divinities like Apollo, Ceres, Venus, and Minerva as blonde, but also Romulus and Lucretia. Likewise, Juvenal, Catullus, Tibullus, Seneca, Statius, and Claudian speak of blonde gods, heroes, and heroines, and Gunther also for Rome undertakes this by now oft-mentioned research of all the testimonials which might report a Nordic type, or a type with string Nordic imprint, up to Caesar and Augustus. It is almost superfluous to say what conception Rosenberg and the other racists have regarding the successive imperial period. It is Chamberlain's old motif. The Rome which becomes a global empire is the Rome which destroys race, which founders in ethnic chaos, which punicizes, which declines. The wars which gave power to Rome destroyed its patriciate and its healthy agricultural class. The laws of caste deteriorate. Birth rates decline among the aristocracy. Merchants and new rich rise to every office, rushing from all parts of the globe, trafficking and developing unchecked capitalistic and devastating instincts. Bastard emperors and even emperors of color take up the scepter. Religious decomposition results in syncretism, in the definitive and unconditional introduction of Eastern cults, in the flight to philosophical consolations. Finally, an anguish and a diseased need of liberation pervades that ethnic chaos, the cosmopolitan plebs of the Orientalized empire. From the east rises Christianity, which conquers the masses. With Constantine it becomes the religion of state, and its fanaticism destroys the last philosophers of those schools of the late empire, in which the residues of a knowledge which once had been Nordic were yet preserved. Priestly dominion and despotism, the watermarks of the sub-race, win along the entire front. Von Leers concludes these considerations in this way. At the end of classic antiquity we find a terrible cemetery of the Nordic race. Romanism and Hellenism have collapsed. Their last representatives in Asia Minor, in northern Africa, and in Spain are in great part wiped away by desertic Islam, the Teutonic Oriental peoples are destroyed and dissolved, the Persians are the servants of the Arabs, the Arya of India are momentarily under the dominion of the Huns. The only remaining Nordic peoples are the Western Teutonics, certain Teutonics of the south such as the Bavarians, the Lombards, slowly degenerating in northern Italy, and finally the Slavs, who pressed as far as Elba, and who are almost without a history.